blood pooling on the cold marble floor was my last memory. In my previous life, I bled out beneath the shattered crystal of the Kingsley estate chandelier. I had begged my biological parents for a scrap of affection, only to be framed for embezzlement, stripped of my true identity, and pushed over the balcony by the fake daughter they adored. I died a discarded tragic joke while they celebrated my ruin. But when my eyes snapped open, I was breathing. I was back in the squalid living room of my childhood, staring at my wealthy biological parents, as they offered a bribe to keep their imposter. This time, I didn't cry, I didn't beg. I just smiled, signed the papers, and let them invite a curse over their threshold. The pain of a shattered spine doesn't fade, even across the boundary of death. It lingers like a phantom electric shock at the base of your neck. That was the first thing I felt when I opened my eyes. Not the moldy scent of the Miller household, nor the oppressive humidity of a mid-August afternoon, but the ghost of marble crushing my bones. Look at her, Roman. She's staring at us like a frightened stray. The voice was crisp, dripping with an aristocratic impatience that made my stomach churn. I blinked. The blurry shapes in front of me, sharpening into agonizingly familiar figures. Victoria Kingsley, my biological mother. She was sitting on the sagging floral sofa in Thomas Miller's dilapidated living room. Her tailored Chanel suit, looking absurdly out of place against the peeling wallpaper. Beside her sat Roman Kingsley, checking his Patek Philippe watch as if my existence was keeping him from a tea time. I sucked in a harsh breath. The calendar on the wall, a cheap giveaway from a local hardware store, read the 14th of August, 2018. I was 21 again, the day of the reclamation. In my past life, this was the day the Kingsleys discovered that the daughter they had raised for 21 years, Grace, was not their own. A clerical error at St. Jude's Memorial Hospital, an exhausted nurse, and a swapped bassinet had altered our destinies. In that life, when Roman and Victoria showed up at this wretched house, I had wept. I had thrown myself at them, desperate to escape the abusive, alcoholic grasp of Thomas and Sarah Miller. I had believed that returning to my real family would be my salvation. Instead, it was a descent into hell. The Kingsleys didn't want a daughter who smelled of cheap detergent and worked double shifts at a diner. They wanted Grace. Grace, who played the cello, spoke fluent French, and was engaged to Preston Shaw, the heir to Shaw Pharmaceuticals. When they took me in, it wasn't out of love. It was damage control. They hid me away, paraded Grace as their true pride. And when I finally tried to claim my rightful shares in the Kingsley conglomerate, Grace orchestrated my murder, weeping at my funeral while wearing my grandmother's pearls. Evelyn, are you listening to me? Roman's sharp voice cut through my thoughts. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. This is a difficult situation for all of us. Thomas and Sarah have explained the reality of your upbringing. Thomas, the man who had backhanded me 2 days ago for dropping a plate, nodded eagerly. He was clutching a manila envelope. Inside, I knew was a cashier's check for $500,000. Hush money. We want to do the right thing, Victoria chimed in, though she held a lace handkerchief near her nose, clearly offended by the smell of boiled cabbage lingering in the house. We will take you to the estate. We will pay for you to finish your degree. But you must understand Grace is fragile. She has a heart condition. The shock of losing her place in our family would kill her. Here it was. The proposition that broke my heart in my first life. We are going to tell the press and our social circle that you are a distant cousin from my mother's side, Roman said smoothly, his eyes cold and calculating. We are officially adopting you. Grace remains a Kingsley. You will be Evelyn Kingsley, but quietly in the background. Do we have an understanding? In my past life, I screamed. I demanded my birthright. I called them monsters. It only cemented their hatred of me and painted me as an unhinged, greedy peasant. I lowered my head, letting my ratty, unwashed hair fall over my face to hide the terrifyingly wide smile stretching across my lips. When I finally looked up, my eyes were wide, brimming with manufactured tears of gratitude. Mr. and Mrs. Kingsley, I whispered, my voice trembling with practiced fragility. I don't want to hurt Grace. I know I don't belong in your world. The fact that you would take me in at all. It's more than I ever dreamed. I'll sign whatever you need. I just want a safe place to sleep. Victoria blinked, completely taken back by my submission. The disgust in her eyes morphed into a fleeting, patronizing pity. Well, at least she is sensible, Roman. Sensible? Yes, I was very sensible. They wanted a docile, invisible ghost to haunt the edges of their perfect portrait. They had no idea they were inviting the devil into the frame. The drive to the Kingsley estate in Gladwin, Pennsylvania, was suffocatingly quiet. I sat in the back of the Bentley, watching the sprawling oak trees and wrought iron gates pass by. Roman was on his phone aggressively negotiating a merger for Kingsley Holdings while Victoria scrolled through her iPad, finalizing the guest list for their upcoming charity gala. Neither of them looked back at me. My mind was a whirlwind of calculations. In my previous life, I had spent my first months in the estate trying to learn table etiquette, sobbing in my room when my older brother, Nathaniel, mocked my lack of education. I had tried to compete with Grace on her own turf. That was a fool's game. You don't beat a pig by wrestling it in the mud. You drain the pen. When the car finally pulled up to the circular driveway, the imposing limestone facade of the mansion loomed like a fortress. The grand mahogany doors opened, and there she was, Grace Kingsley. She stood at the top of the steps wearing a pristine white sundress, her blonde hair styled in effortless waves. Next to her stood Nathaniel, tall, athletic, and fiercely protective, glaring down at me as if I were a cockroach that had skewered into their foyer. And behind them, leaning against the doorframe with an arrogant smirk, was Preston Shaw, my future fiancé in my past life. The man who kissed me in the dark and handed Grace the financial documents that framed me. Mon Dad. Grace breathed, rushing down the steps. She threw her arms around Victoria, burying her face in her neck. I was so worried. I couldn't sleep. Oh, my sweet girl. Victoria cooped, instantly melting. The cold, sterile woman who had looked at me with disdain in the Miller house was suddenly full of warmth. Everything is fine. The arrangement is settled. Grace pulled back, turning her large doe-like eyes toward me. She approached me cautiously, like I was an unpredictable animal. You must be Evelyn. I can't imagine how hard this is for you, but I want us to be sisters. I want to share my life with you. The performance was Oscar-worthy. If I hadn't felt her hands shoving me backward over the balcony rail, I might have believed her. Thank you, Grace, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I hunched my shoulders, making myself look smaller, more pathetic. You have a beautiful home. Nathaniel scoffed, crossing his arms. Don't get too comfortable, charity case. You're here because our parents are generous, not because you earned it. Stay out of Grace's way, and we won't have a problem. Nathaniel, be polite, Roman reprimanded, though there was no real heat in his voice. Evelyn will be staying in the East Wing guest quarters. Maria will show her the way. The East Wing. In my past life, I had thrown a fit over this. The East Wing was notoriously drafty, isolated, and historically used for the domestic staff before the renovations in the 9S. Grace's room was a sprawling suite in the South Wing, complete with a balcony overlooking the rose gardens. Actually, I spoke up softly, catching everyone's attention. If it isn't too much trouble, could I stay in the attic room, the one above the old library? Silence fell over the foyer. Victoria frowned deeply. The attic? Evelyn, that room hasn't been used in years. It's dusty and the plumbing is archaic. Why on earth would you want to stay there? I'm used to small spaces, I stammered, looking down at my scuffed sneakers. Large rooms make me anxious. The Miller's house was very cramped. I think I would feel safer there. Out of the way. I really don't want to be a burden. I saw the flicker of triumph in Grace's eyes, quickly masked by fake sympathy. She thought I was accepting my place at the bottom of the hierarchy. She thought I was breaking myself so she wouldn't have to. But I knew something they didn't. The Kingsley estate was old and Roman was a paranoid man. He didn't trust digital servers for his most sensitive illegal dealings, the offshore shell companies, the bribes paid to FDA officials for Shaw Pharmaceuticals, the tax evasion blueprints. He kept physical ledgers. And in my past life, during a drunken rant 3 years from now, Nathaniel had let slip that the old man's safe wasn't in his study. It was hidden behind the false brickwork of the old library chimney. The very chimney that ran directly up into the walls of the attic room. If that is what you truly want, Roman said, waving a hand dismissively. Maria, take her up. As I walked past Grace, She leaned in, her sweet floral perfume filling my nose. Smart girl. She whispered so softly only I could hear. Know your place and you might survive here. I smiled at her, a genuine terrifying smile that made her flinch. Oh, Grace, I murmured back. I'm going to thrive. The attic room was exactly as Victoria described. It was a suffocating wood-paneled box, smelling of mothballs and dead spiders. A single narrow window looked out over the driveway, but to me, it was a war room. Over the next 3 weeks, I played my role perfectly. I was the ghost of the Kingsley estate. I wore the drab, oversized clothes I had brought with me, refusing Victoria's half-hearted offers to take me shopping. I spoke only when spoken to, kept my head down, and spent hours reading in the old library beneath my room. The family quickly grew comfortable with my invisibility, which was exactly what I needed. People don't hide their sins from the furniture. My first target wasn't Grace. She was too well protected by the family's blind adoration. To bring down the princess, I needed to dismantle her knights. I started with my dear brother, Nathaniel. Nathaniel was a senior at the prestigious Wharton School at Upton. He was supposed to be the golden boy, the heir apparent to Kingsley Holdings. But Nathaniel had a secret I only discovered in my past life when the SEC investigated the family. Nathaniel was a gambling addict, and he had been silently siphoning funds from a secondary corporate account to pay off a massive debt to a bookie in Atlantic City. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Grace was out at a spa day with Victoria and Roman was in New York. Nathaniel was in the main dining room, furiously typing on his laptop, an empty tumbler of scotch next to him, despite it being barely 2:00 p.m. Claire's throat slipped into the room with a silver tray holding a fresh pot of coffee. Maria, the housekeeper, had been more than happy to let me take over some chores, pitying the poor relative. I thought you might need some coffee, Nathaniel, I said meekly, setting the tray down near his elbow. He jumped, snapping his laptop shut with a violent crack. Damn it. Evelyn. Don't sneak up on me. Are you a mouse? I'm sorry, I whispered, taking a step back. I just noticed you looked stressed. Are your midterms approaching? He scoffed, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. Like you would know anything about academic stress. Just leave it and get out. I turned to go, but paused near the doorway. I only ask because, well, a man came to the gates this morning. He asked for you. Nathaniel froze. The color drained from his face instantly. A man who? I don't know. I lied smoothly. He wouldn't give his name to the security guard. I was walking by the gatehouse. He was wearing a cheap suit, drove a black Lincoln. He said to tell you the grace period was over and that he'd be seeing you in the city on Friday. I assumed it was something to do with your university. The lie was perfectly tailored. In my past life, his bookie's enforcer drove a black Lincoln and confronted him on a Friday. The terror in Nathaniel's eyes was absolute. His hands began to shake slightly. Did you tell Dad? He choked out. No, I said, opening my eyes wide in feigned innocence. Should I have? I can go call his assistant. No. Nathaniel shouted, shooting up from his chair. He realized his volume and visibly forced himself to calm down. No. It's a misunderstanding from a fraternity prank. Keep your mouth shut about this, Evelyn. Do you understand? Don't tell Mom. Don't tell Dad. And definitely don't tell Grace. Of course, Nathaniel. I won't say a word. I promised dutifully. I walked out of the room. My heart beating a steady victorious rhythm. The seed was planted. Panic makes people reckless. Nathaniel would scramble to cover his debts, likely pulling more heavily from the corporate accounts, and when he did, I would be ready to make sure Roman noticed the discrepancy. Later that evening, the family gathered for dinner. Preston Shaw was joining us. He sat next to Grace, holding her hand under the table. He was devastatingly handsome with sharp jawlines and piercing blue eyes. In my past life, I had fallen desperately in love with him. He had told me he felt trapped by his engagement to Grace, that he loved my authenticity. It was all a lie to keep me complacent while he helped Grace forge my signature on the embezzlement documents. So, Evelyn, Preston drawled, taking a sip of his wine. He looked at me with a mixture of amusement and disdain. Grace tells me you've been spending all your time in the old library, finding anything interesting in the dust. Grace giggled softly. I told her she should come to the country club with me, but she says she prefers the quiet. I looked up from my plate, meeting Preston's gaze directly for the first time since my rebirth. I didn't see the man I loved. I saw the man who watched me fall. History is fascinating. Preston, I said, my voice eerily calm, devoid of the stutter I usually faked. You can learn a lot by digging into the past. For instance, I was reading about corporate structures in the 1920s. Did you know how common it was for legacy companies to hide illicit assets in plain sight using, say, pharmaceutical shell companies in Delaware? The dining room went dead silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. Roman's fork hovered halfway to his mouth. Preston's smug smile vanished, replaced by a rigid, guarded expression. Shaw Pharmaceuticals had exactly 3 shell companies in Delaware used for off-the-books political lobbying. It was highly classified information. Where on earth did you read about that? Roman demanded, his voice dangerously low. I immediately dropped my gaze, my shoulders slouching back into my submissive posture. Oh, just a thriller novel I found on the bottom shelf. A fiction book. Was it? Did I say something wrong? The tension in the room was palpable. Roman and Preston exchanged a quick, paranoid look. Grace looked utterly confused. No, Preston said tightly. Just an oddly specific topic for a fiction novel. I have an overactive imagination, I whispered, taking a small bite of my peas. They thought I was an ignorant, lucky fool who stumbled upon a coincidence. But as I chewed my food in the suffocating silence of the Kingsley dining room, I knew the poison was already working its way through their veins. The empire was built on secrets, and I held all the matches. The Kingsley estate at 3:00 a.m. was a different beast entirely. Gone was the polished veneer of old money and daytime pleasantries. In the dark, the mansion settled into its true nature, a creaking, groaning labyrinth of secrets. I sat on the edge of my narrow, lumpy mattress in the attic, staring at the digital clock on my cheap burner phone, 3:15 a.m., perfect. The heavy silence of the house meant even Maria, the notoriously early-rising housekeeper, was deep in REM sleep. I slipped off the bed, my bare feet silent on the dusty floorboards. In my previous life, I had spent hours sobbing in this very room, feeling like a forgotten prisoner. This time, I saw the room for what it was, a strategic vantage point. The old library sat directly beneath my attic cell. When the house was renovated in the late 90s, they had modernized the heating, but left the massive 1920s brick chimney intact for aesthetic purposes. What nobody remembered except for a paranoid Roman and a very drunk Nathaniel in my past life was the old ash drop shaft. It was a narrow parallel chute designed for servants to sweep ash from the upper fireplaces straight down to the basement. It had been boarded up in the library, but up here in the attic, the heavy iron grate was merely painted shut. I knelt beside the fireplace, taking a flathead screwdriver I had swiped from the gardener's shed. I jammed it into the groove of the grate and applied pressure. With a harsh metallic snap that sounded loud enough to wake the dead, the decades-old paint cracked. I held my breath, waiting for the sound of approaching footsteps. Nothing. Prying the grate loose, I aimed my phone's flashlight down the shaft. It was filthy, lined with a century of soot, but it was wide enough. More importantly, it provided direct access to the void behind the library's false chimney breast. I tied a thick coil of heavy-duty rope purchased at the local hardware store during a rare trip into town around the sturdy iron radiator bolted to the floor. Wrapping the other end around my waist, I squeezed into the shaft. The descent was claustrophobic and suffocating. Soot coated my throat and rough bricks scraped my elbows raw. But the physical pain grounded me. It reminded me of the marble floor. It reminded me of why I was here. About 15 feet down, my feet hit a solid wooden crossbeam. I was standing in the hollow space directly behind the library fireplace. I turned my flashlight toward the back of the brickwork. There it was, built seamlessly into the dark stone was a heavy matte black steel door. Roman's biometric and keypad safe. In my first life, Roman's paranoia had been his ultimate downfall. He didn't trust thumbprints, they could be replicated or severed. He trusted numbers. But his ego dictated that the numbers had to mean something profound to him. Something no corporate spy could guess. I wiped the soot from my fingers and hovered my hand over the glowing blue keypad. Jojo Su. The 14th of November, 1994. It wasn't an anniversary. It wasn't a birthday. It was the exact date Victoria Kingsley had suffered her first highly publicized miscarriage, a boy. Roman had been devastated, not out of paternal love, but because he had lost his first male heir. He memorialized that loss by making it the gateway to his darkest secrets. The keypad beeped a soft, affirming green. The heavy bolts retracted with a satisfying oily clunk. I pulled the safe door open. Inside were stacks of pristine ledgers, a velvet box containing Victoria's emergency diamonds, and several thick manila folders. I ignored the jewels. I was here for blood, not diamonds. I pulled out the first ledger and opened my burner phone's camera app. For the next hour, surrounded by the smell of ancient ash, I photographed every single page. I documented the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, the illegal campaign contributions disguised as charity donations, and the systematic tax evasion that kept the Kingsley empire afloat. But the real prize was in a folder labeled Projected Acquisitions, Shaw. I opened it, carefully flattening the pages to photograph them. It was a drafted, unsigned contract between Roman and Preston's father. It detailed the upcoming merger of Kingsley Holdings and Shaw Pharmaceuticals. But tucked in the back was a private addendum, a side deal negotiated by Preston himself. I read the paragraphs, a cold smile stretching across my soot-stained face. Preston was planning a hostile takeover. The addendum outlined a strategy to devalue Kingsley Holdings immediately following his marriage to Grace, allowing the Shaw family to buy up the majority shares for pennies. Preston didn't love Grace. He viewed her as a Trojan horse. Once he had the ring on her finger and the shares in his grasp, he planned to institutionalize her, citing her fragile heart condition and escalating mental instability. He was going to do to Grace exactly what they had all done to me. I snapped photos of the addendum, making sure Preston's signature on the preliminary draft was crystal clear. Then I carefully returned everything to its exact place, closed the safe, and scrambled back up the rope to the attic. As I scrubbed the soot from my skin in the freezing water of the attic basin, I looked at my reflection in the cracked mirror. My eyes were bright, feverish with anticipation. I had the blueprint to their destruction in the palm of my hand. Now it was time to light the match. The Kingsley Summer Gala was exactly 1 week away, and the estate was buzzing with a frantic, suffocating energy. Caterers were in and out. Florists were arguing over the shade of the centerpieces. And Victoria was operating on a steady diet of black coffee, snapping at the staff over the slightest infractions. I remained the invisible ghost, drifting through the hallways in my oversized sweaters, carrying trays of water and making myself entirely unremarkable. Grace, on the other hand, was the star of the show. She glided through the chaos in tailored silk loungewear, playing the role of the benevolent, exhausted Ares, but I could see the cracks forming. Nathaniel was avoiding everyone. His eyes bloodshot, his temper volatile. My planted lie about the bookie's enforcer was eating him alive. He had already pawned 2 of his Rolex watches. I had seen the receipts in his wastebasket. It was time to introduce Grace to the concept of paranoia. It happened on a Thursday afternoon. Grace was lounging in the sunroom, flipping through a bridal magazine. Preston was supposed to arrive for dinner that evening. I entered quietly, carrying a silver tray with a picture of iced tea and a plate of lemon wedges. "I brought you some tea, Grace," I said softly, setting the tray on the glass table. "Maria said you were feeling a bit fatigued." Grace looked up, offering me that familiar saccharine smile. "Thank you, Evelyn. You're so sweet. Really, you don't have to play maid for us. You're family." "I like to be useful," I replied, keeping my eyes downcast. I hesitated, shifting my weight from foot to foot, biting my lower lip as if debating whether to speak. Grace noticed immediately. She thrived on being the confidant, the one in control. "What is it, Evelyn? You look anxious." "It's probably nothing," I stammered, wringing my hands. I didn't want to overstep." "I know. I don't understand how things work in your world. Tell me," she insisted, closing her magazine and leaning forward, her curiosity piqued. "Well," I began, my voice trembling perfectly. "Yesterday, when I was dusting Roman's study, Preston was in there waiting for him. I didn't mean to pry, but I saw what he was looking at on Roman's desk. Grace's smile faltered slightly. Preston is Dad's business partner. It's normal for them to share documents. I know, I said quickly. But it wasn't a business document. It was your medical file. The one from Dr. Heiress? No, Dr. Evans, the cardiologist. He was taking pictures of it with his phone. Grace froze. The color drained from her perfectly rouged cheeks. Her medical history was her most guarded secret, a vulnerability she hated. My medical file? Why would Preston be looking at my medical file? I don't know. I lied, looking up at her with wide, innocent eyes. He looked very serious, and he was muttering something about power of attorney. I thought maybe it was a normal thing for engaged couples to do. I'm sorry if I shouldn't have said anything. Power of attorney? Grace whispered, her voice laced with sudden ice. In Pennsylvania, a spouse with power of attorney over a medically fragile partner could make sweeping financial and legal decisions. Grace was vain and cruel, but she wasn't stupid. She knew the power dynamics of her own class. Forget I said anything. I backpedaled frantically, backing towards the door. Please don't tell him I told you. He already looks at me like I'm dirt. I don't want to make him angry. I fled the room before she could respond, leaving her alone with the toxic seed of doubt. But a seed needs water to grow, and I was ready to open the floodgates. 10 minutes later, from the safety of my attic, I booted up the burner phone. I had created a secure encrypted email address routing through a VPN in Switzerland. I attached one specific cropped photograph from my midnight raid, the section of the Shaw addendum detailing the hostile takeover of Kingsley Holdings, complete with the list of Preston's Delaware shell companies. I typed in Preston's private unlisted email address, a detail I had memorized during my short-lived engagement to him in my past life. The subject line was simple. She knows. The body of the email contained only one sentence. Grace is auditing the Delaware accounts. Fix your mess before the wedding. I hit send. The beauty of a closed ecosystem, like the Kingsley social circle, is that trust is entirely transactional. They don't love each other. They rely on mutually assured destruction. By inserting a single undeniable piece of truth into their fragile alliance, I was pulling the pin on a grenade and locking them in a room together. Dinner that night was a masterpiece of agonizing tension. Preston arrived looking immaculate in a navy blazer. But the rigid set of his jaw and the frantic searching looks he kept shooting around the room betrayed him. He had seen the email. He was terrified. He thought Grace, the delicate flower he was planning to crush, had outmaneuvered him and discovered his betrayal. Grace sat beside him, radiating a chilling, passive-aggressive energy. Every time Preston leaned in to speak to her, she pulled away slightly, her eyes darting to his pockets, wondering if he had her medical files on his phone. Everything all right, Preston? Roman asked gruffly from the head of the table, slicing into his prime rib. You seem distracted. Just a minor headache at the office. Roman Preston lied smoothly, though his eyes darted toward Grace. Some unexpected auditing issues. Grace's fork scraped against her china plate with a shrill screech. Auditing? She asked, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. How fascinating. Are you making sure all your contingencies are in order before we tie the knot, darling? Preston flinched. The word contingencies was exactly what was written on the file I had photographed. He stared at Grace, his blue eyes widening in a mixture of horror and fury. He thought she was mocking him, letting him know she had the upper hand. My contingencies are perfectly fine, Grace, he replied, his voice dropping an octave, losing all its usual warmth. Though I am surprised you're suddenly so interested in my business, you usually prefer to leave the heavy lifting to the adults. The insult hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Victoria gasped softly. Nathaniel, too lost in his own gambling panic, didn't even look up from his mashed potatoes. Grace's eyes narrowed into venomous slits. I'm interested in a lot of things, Preston, like my own health and my own future. You do well to remember that I am a Kingsley, not a piece of property you can manage. Enough, Roman barked, slamming his fist on the table. What is wrong with the two of you? You're acting like enemies, not a couple weeks away from a wedding. I sat at the far end of the table, entirely ignored by the wearing factions. I kept my head down, taking a small, polite sip of my water. Beneath the heavy mahogany table, my hands were steady. I wasn't the scared, broken girl they had discarded in my past life. I was the architect of their ruin, and the demolition had officially begun. The Kingsley Summer Gala was an opulent display of generational wealth and social armor. 300 of Pennsylvania's elite descended upon the estate, their luxury vehicles clogging the winding driveway. The sprawling back lawns had been transformed into a glittering wonderland, complete with a massive silk tent, a 20-piece orchestra, and cascading towers of imported champagne. The stated purpose of the gala was to raise funds for the pediatric wing of St. Jude's Memorial, the very hospital where an exhausted nurse had supposedly swapped Grace and me 21 years ago. The irony tasted like copper on my tongue. I was permitted to attend, but only under strict instructions from Victoria. Wear the understated navy dress, stay near the perimeter, and do not speak to the press. I was more than happy to comply. I stood in the shadows near the extravagant ice sculpture, a phantom haunting my own family's celebration. From my vantage point, I watched the players take the stage. Roman was in his element, shaking hands with senators and tech moguls, projecting the image of a titan. Victoria draped herself in diamonds and false modesty, accepting compliments on her philanthropic spirit. Grace and Preston were playing the perfect dazzling couple for the cameras, though the physical distance between them was palpable. Whenever Preston placed a hand on the small of her back, Grace's spine went rigid. The poison was festering, but my focus tonight was entirely on Nathaniel. He looked horrific underneath the tailored Tom Ford tuxedo. He was sweating profusely. He was downing fluts of champagne like water, his eyes darting frantically around the room. Today was Friday. The deadline the bookie's enforcer had supposedly given him. I knew the psychological pressure of a ticking clock. It made you sloppy. It made you desperate. The centerpiece of the evening was the silent auction managed entirely through a secure blackboard digital portal on the guests' smartphones. The goal was to raise $2 million by midnight. At 10:30 p.m., Roman took the stage to give his keynote speech. The crowd quieted, turning their attention to the charismatic patriarch. This was Nathaniel's window. I watched as my brother slipped away from the edge of the crowd, disappearing into the mansion through the terrace doors. I waited exactly 2 minutes before following him, moving silently through the empty, echoing halls of the estate. I found him in Roman's ground floor study. The heavy mahogany door was cracked open just a fraction. I peered through the sliver of light. Nathaniel was sitting at his father's desk, hands trembling as he typed frantically on Roman's unlocked laptop. He was bypassing the charity's routing system, attempting to redirect the incoming digital auction funds into a shell account to cover his fictitious Atlantic City debt. He thought he was being clever. He thought his father wouldn't notice a missing $200,000 hidden within the chaotic influx of multi-million-dollar charity donations until Monday morning. What Nathaniel didn't know was that I had spent the afternoon in this very study quietly altering the administrator alert settings on Roman's banking software. I had set a trigger. Any wire transfer exceeding $50,000 would instantly send a push notification to Roman's Apple Watch along with an automated text to the estate's private security chief detailing the IP address of the device, making the transfer. Click. Nathaniel hit the final confirmation key. Outside on the lawn, Roman was mid-sentence, waxing poetic about the future of pediatric medicine. I couldn't see him, but I knew exactly what was happening. His wrist vibrated. He glanced down, expecting a text from his assistant. Instead, he saw his own son robbing a children's charity from his home IP network. Nathaniel. I pushed the study door open just enough to step inside, my eyes wide with manufactured innocence. Nathaniel whipped around, slamming the laptop shut. The blood drained from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse in a tuxedo. Evelyn, what the hell are you doing in here? I was just looking for a restroom away from the crowds, I stammered, shrinking back against the door frame. Are you okay? You look pale. Get out, he hissed, standing up so fast his chair toppled backward. If you breathe a word that I was in here to anyone, I swear to God. The heavy oak doors of the study flew open, slamming against the walls with a thunderous crack. Roman stood in the doorway, his face a mask of absolute terrifying rage. Behind him stood 2 of the estate's armed security guards. The contrast between Roman's polished gala attire and the primal fury in his eyes was staggering. Dad, Nathaniel choked out, stepping away from the desk. I needed to check an email. Save it. Roman snarled, his voice a low, lethal vibration. He marched across the room, grabbed Nathaniel by the lapels of his tuxedo, and shoved him hard against the bookshelves. Volumes of law and history cascaded to the floor. You did degenerate, little thief. You tried to siphon $250,000 from the Street Jude's ledger, from my IP address during my gala. Dad, please. I can explain. I was in trouble. There's a guy. He was going to kill me. Evelyn knows. She saw him. Nathaniel pointed a shaking finger at me. Roman slowly turned his head to look at me. I immediately burst into tears, covering my mouth with trembling hands. I don't know what he's talking about, Mr. Kingsley. I swear I've been in the library reading. I don't know any men. You lying, Nathaniel screamed, lunging toward me, but the security guards grabbed his arms, pinning him back. Take him to the pool house. Roman ordered the guards. His chest heaving. Lock him in. Confiscate his phone. If he tries to leave, break his legs. I will deal with the police and the bank discreetly tomorrow. As the guards dragged a sobbing, screaming Nathaniel out of the room, Roman slumped against his desk, burying his face in his hands. The golden boy was broken. The heir was a liability. I stood in the corner, wiping away my tears. My heart steady and calm. One night down. Now for the king and the princess. The fallout from the gala was swift and brutal. By Sunday morning, Nathaniel had been quietly exiled to a luxury rehabilitation center in Arizona. His bank accounts frozen, his name scrubbed from the Kingsley Holdings executive roster. Victoria had locked herself in her suite, claiming a migraine, while Roman buried himself in damage control with his PR team, trying to cover up the missing charity funds before the board found out. The house felt like a tomb. And in that suffocating silence, Grace's paranoia reached its boiling point. Without Nathaniel to act as a buffer and a confidant, Grace was isolated. She spent hours pacing the rose gardens, clutching her phone, waiting for the other shoe to drop regarding Preston's supposed audits of her medical files. It was time to give her the proof she was so desperately seeking. On Tuesday afternoon, Preston came to the estate to meet with Roman. It was a tense, strictly business affair. Preston left his tailored suit jacket draped over a chair in the foyer while they sequestered themselves in the dining room to discuss the impending merger. I descended from my attic, a feather duster in hand. Maria was busy in the kitchen and the foyer was empty. I walked over to Preston's jacket, reached into my apron, and pulled out a neatly folded piece of paper. It was a physical print out of the Shaw Addendum, the hostile takeover plan, complete with a list of his offshore shell companies, and the strategy to declare Grace medically unfit. I slipped the folded paper halfway into the inner breast pocket of his jacket, leaving just enough of the Kingsley corporate letterhead visible to catch the eye. 10 minutes later, I found Grace in the sunroom, nervously shredding a napkin into tiny pieces. Grace, I murmured softly. She jumped, glaring at me. What is it, Evelyn? I'm not in the mood for your hovering today. I'm sorry, I said, looking down. I was dusting the foyer and Preston's jacket fell off the chair. A paper slipped out. I picked it up to put it back. But I saw your name on it, along with the word institutionalize. Grace froze. The shredded napkin fluttered from her fingers to the floor. What did you say? I shouldn't have looked, I babbled, faking a panic attack. I'm so sorry. I put it back in his pocket. Just please don't tell him I saw it. I didn't need to say another word. Grace pushed past me, her silk robe billowing behind her like the wings of a predatory bird. She marched straight into the foyer. I followed at a safe distance, watching from the shadow of the grand staircase. Grace reached Preston's jacket, yanked the paper from the pocket, and unfolded it. I watched her eyes scan the text. I watched her pupils dilate. I watched the realization hit her like a physical blow. The man she was going to marry didn't just want her family's company. He wanted to lock her in a gilded cage and throw away the key. All her vanity, all her pride shattered in an instant. At that exact moment, the dining room doors opened. Preston and Roman walked out, still engaged in a low, tense conversation. Preston stopped dead in his tracks when he saw Grace standing in the foyer, trembling, violently, clutching the paper. Grace, darling, Preston said, his voice cautious. What's wrong, you bastard? She whispered, her voice cracking. Then she screamed it. You absolute sociopathic bastard. Roman stepped forward, alarmed. Grace, keep your voice down. What on earth is going on? Grace threw the paper at Preston's chest. It fluttered to the marble floor between them. Read it, Dad. Read what your golden partner is planning. He's using the merger to execute a hostile takeover. He's transferring the voting rights to a shell company in Delaware. And he's planning to have me declared mentally incompetent the minute we return from our honeymoon. Roman looked at the paper. Then at Preston. The color drained from Preston's face. For a man who built his life on control, being caught red-handed was an alien experience. He looked frantically at his jacket, realizing he had never printed that document. It only existed on his encrypted hard drive. He had no idea how it got there. Roman, this is a misunderstanding. Preston lied, holding his hands up defensively. That's an old draft. A stress test scenario my legal team mocked up. A stress test? Grace shrieked, stepping forward and slapping him across the face with a sickening smack. You were going to lock me up. You were going to steal everything. She turned to Roman, tears streaming down her perfectly contoured face. Call the wedding off. Call it off right now. I will see him dead before I marry him. Preston's shock morphed into cold, venomous fury. He touched his rein, his blue eyes narrowing at Grace. The charming fiancé was gone. The ruthless corporate shark remained. You really want to play this game, Grace? Preston sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. You think you hold the cards here? You're a fragile, unstable girl playing dress-up. If Roman cancels this merger, Kingsley Holdings will crash by Friday. You need Shaw Capital to cover the margins your idiot brother blew. Without me, you're nothing. Get out of my house, Roman growled, his fists clenched at his sides. He was trapped, and he knew it. He needed Preston's money, but his pride couldn't stomach the betrayal. Gladly, Preston snapped, grabbing his jacket. He looked at Grace one last time, a cruel, mocking smile on his lips. Good luck explaining to the board why the wedding is off, sweetheart. Let's see how long they keep backing a fake Heiress, who doesn't even have Kingsley blood in her veins. The silence in the foyer was absolute. Preston turned and walked out the front doors. The heavy mahogany slamming shut behind him. Grace collapsed onto the bottom step of the staircase, sobbing hysterically. Roman stared blankly at the wall. The empire he had built crumbling around him in real time. I stood in the shadows, perfectly still, perfectly quiet. I hadn't raised my voice once, I hadn't lifted a finger against them. All I had done was hand them the knives they had sharpened themselves. The curse was taking hold and the house was burning from the inside out. The Monday following Preston's explosive departure was the day the sky truly fell on the Kingsley estate. At 9:30 a.m., the opening bell of the New York Stock Exchange rang. At 9:31 a.m., Shaw Pharmaceuticals issued a sterile, devastating press release announcing the immediate and permanent termination of their acquisition talks with Kingsley Holdings, citing irreconcilable strategic differences and unforeseen internal liabilities. By noon, Kingsley Holdings stock had plummeted 42%. The market smelled blood in the water. The rumors of Nathaniel's leave of absence and the sudden cancellation of the society wedding of the decade fueled the panic selling. I sat in the old library dusting the same shelf of encyclopedias for the third time, listening to the muffled sounds of destruction echoing from Roman's study upstairs. The heavy thud of a crystal decanter shattering against a wall. The frantic screaming match between Roman and his board of directors over speakerphone. The empire was bleeding out and the sharks were circling. Grace had locked herself in the south wing. Without Preston, without her status as the future Mrs. Shaw, she was unmed. She had spent the last 48 hours frantically calling her society friends, trying to spin the narrative that she had dumped Preston because he was too controlling. But in the world of the ultra-wealthy, loyalty is tied to capital. With Kingsley stock in free fall, her calls went straight to voicemail. The tension finally snapped on Wednesday evening. I was in the kitchen helping Maria polish the good silver, a menial task I insisted on doing just to remain a fly on the wall. Victoria burst through the swinging doors, her usually immaculate hair frizzy and unkempt, her eyes wide with a manic, terrified energy. She carried a sleek black leather tote bag. "Maria, tell the driver to bring the Mercedes around to the back entrance." Victoria snapped, her voice trembling. "Do it now." "Ma'am, are you going somewhere?" Maria asked, startled. "I am leaving. I refuse to go down with that sinking ship in the study," Victoria hissed, pacing the terracotta floor. "Roman has lost his mind. He's talking about leveraging my trust fund to cover the margin calls. My money. I won't let him drag me into the gutter." She slammed her tote bag onto the marble island. The zipper parted slightly, and I caught the unmistakable glint of the velvet box I had seen inside the chimney safe. The emergency diamonds valued at over $3 million. "I have a flight to Geneva in 4 hours, Victoria muttered almost to herself, her hands shaking as she pulled out her phone. "I can liquidate the stones in Switzerland. I can start over. He's not taking me down with him." I kept my head bowed, rhythmically polishing a silver spoon. A cold, sharp smile tugged at the corners of my mouth. What Victoria didn't know was that on the night I cracked Roman's safe, I hadn't just taken photographs. I had come prepared. Months before, I had purchased a set of high-quality cubic zirconia replicas online, a risk, but a calculated one. While I was covered in soot, documenting their crimes, I had swapped the flawless Kingsley heirloom diamonds for worthless glass. "Have a safe trip, Mrs. Kingsley," I murmured softly, not looking up. She paused, looking at me as if she had forgotten I even existed. The disgust in her eyes was replaced by a fleeting, desperate pity. "You should leave, too, Evelyn. There won't be anything left of this place by Friday. Go back to whatever hole you crawled out of. It's safer there." She turned on her heel and marched out the back door, leaving her husband and her beloved daughter to burn. With Victoria gone and Roman entirely consumed by his financial hemorrhage, the house was utterly defenseless. It was time to deliver the final blow. I retreated to my attic room and booted up the burner phone. I opened the encrypted files containing the photographs of Roman's physical ledgers, the offshore accounts, the bribes, the systematic decade-long tax evasion. I didn't send them to the press. The press would give Roman's lawyers time to spin the narrative, to file injunctions, to muddy the waters. I sent the entire meticulously categorized dossier to the United States Securities and Exchange Commission and directly to the IRS whistleblower office. I included the exact GPS coordinates of the house, the architectural blueprints detailing the ash drop shaft, and the passcode to the biometric safe. Joe. Under the IRS whistleblower informant program, individuals who provide actionable intelligence leading to the recovery of massive tax fraud are legally entitled to between 15 and 30% of the recovered funds. Roman had hidden over $80 million from the federal government. I hit send. I powered down the burner phone, took out the SIM card, and snapped it in half. The match was struck. The powder keg was lit. All I had to do now was watch the explosion. It happened on a Friday morning just as the sun was beginning to peek over the sprawling oak trees of the estate. I was already awake, sitting on the window seat of my attic room, a cup of lukewarm tea in my hands. The silence of the dawn was shattered by the harsh synchronized crunch of heavy tires on gravel. I looked down to see a fleet of 6 matte black SUVs swarming the circular driveway. Men and women in tactical windbreakers bearing the bright yellow letters of the FBI and the IRS poured out of the vehicles. They didn't knock. They took a battering ram to the grand mahogany front doors. The sound echoing through the mansion like a cannon shot. "Federal agents, open the doors. Search warrant." I stood up, smoothed down my oversized sweater, and slowly made my way down the stairs. The house was in absolute chaos. Agents were swarming the foyer, securing the perimeter. Maria was weeping in the corner, a terrified agent gently trying to calm her down. From the south wing, Grace emerged, screaming hysterically. She was wearing a silk nightgown, her hair a tangled mess. "What are you doing? Do you know who we are? Get out of my house." "Ma'am, step back against the wall." An agent barked, pointing a stern finger at her. "I have a heart condition." Grace shrieked, clutching her chest theatrically, dropping to her knees. "I need my doctor. Call Preston Shaw." None of the agents paid her any mind. They had bigger prey. 2 agents dragged Roman out of his study. He was wearing the same wrinkled dress shirt he had had on for 3 days. He looked aged, hollowed out, a ghost of the titan he had been. He wasn't fighting them. He was in a state of catatonic shock. Roman Kingsley. You are under arrest for federal tax evasion, wire fraud, and violations of the Securities Exchange Act. The lead agent read from a clipboard, his voice booming over Grace's sobbing. You have the right to remain silent. The safe, another agent yelled from the back hallway, pointing toward the old library. We have a positive match on the architectural anomaly. Bring the breaching tools. Roman's head snapped up at the word safe. His dead eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked wildly around the room, his gaze finally landing on the landing of the grand staircase. He saw me. I wasn't hunching my shoulders anymore. I wasn't looking at my scuffed sneakers. I stood tall, my hands resting calmly on the mahogany banister, looking down at the wreckage of the family that had thrown me away. Grace, following her father's gaze, looked up at me, her theatrical sobbing hitched. She stared at my calm, unbothered expression, and the gears in her mind finally, agonizingly, began to turn. The lie about Nathaniel's bookie. The slip of the tongue about Delaware shell companies. The drafted contract falling perfectly out of Preston's jacket. The exact location of a safe no one but Roman knew existed. Grace scrambled to her feet, her face contorted in a mask of absolute hatred. She pointed a shaking finger at me. It was her. She did this. She set us up. She's a monster. She lunged toward the stairs, intent on wrapping her hands around my throat, but an FBI agent easily intercepted her, pinning her arms behind her back. Calm down, miss, or you'll be joining him in the back of the cruiser, the agent warned. You don't understand, Grace screamed, tears of genuine despair ruining her face. She stared up at me, her chest heaving. Why? We gave you a home. We took you in. I slowly descended the final few steps, stopping just out of her reach. I looked at Roman, who was trembling in his handcuffs, and then at Grace. You didn't take me in, Grace, I said, my voice smooth, cold, and entirely devoid of the stutter they were so used to. You bought my silence. You tried to turn me into a ghost so you could keep living a lie. But you forgot one very important thing about ghosts. I leaned in slightly, my eyes locking onto hers. They haunt the people who killed them. Roman let out a strangled, broken sob as the agents dragged him out through the shattered front doors. Grace collapsed against the agent holding her, her fake heart condition forgotten in the face of her very real, total destruction. Later that afternoon, the news broke that Victoria Kingsley had been detained by Interpol at the Geneva airport. She had attempted to fence $3 million worth of cubic zirconia to a high-end Swiss jeweler, resulting in an immediate flag for international fraud. The irony was poetic. She was penniless, stranded, and facing extradition. As the federal agents began boxing up the estate, slapping asset forfeit notices on the walls, I quietly packed my single duffel bag. An agent named Davies approached me in the driveway, handing me a sleek embossed business card. Miss Kingsley, he asked gently. Or, Miss Miller. I'm not sure what you prefer to be called. Evelyn is fine, I replied, taking the card. It was from the IRS whistleblower office. The intelligence you provided was unprecedented, Agent Davies said, looking at me with a mixture of awe and caution. The recovery will likely exceed $80 million. As the sole informant, your scheduled payout will be processed within the quarter. It's going to be a substantial sum. You'll need a good wealth management team. I've been reading up on corporate structures. Agent Davies. I smiled, zipping up my bag. I think I'll be perfectly fine. I walked down the long winding driveway of the Kingsley estate for the last time. I didn't look back at the limestone fortress. It was a tomb now, holding nothing but the ashes of a dynasty built on lies. 3 years later, the Kingsley name is a cautionary tale whispered in the boardrooms of Philadelphia. Roman is serving a 20-year sentence in a federal penitentiary in Allenwood. Nathaniel, having been discharged from rehab with no family money to fall back on, manages a mid-tier rental car branch in Nevada. Victoria resides in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in Queens, endlessly appealing her fraud convictions. And Grace, the golden child, the fake A's, married a desperately mundane accountant just to keep a roof over her head, forever stripped of the glamour she would have killed me to keep. As for me, I stand on the balcony of my penthouse in Manhattan, looking out over the glittering skyline. The IRS whistleblower payout granted me a fortune they could never touch. But more importantly, it granted me freedom. In my first life, I died begging for their love. In my rebirth, I smiled, handed them the shovels, and watched them dig their own graves. They thought they were swapping a daughter, but they were wrong. They invited a curse, and I made sure they paid for it with their souls.